When the first snowstorm hit, Samuel's family had little to fear. His cabin stood firm, its hearth crackling with warmth, and his shelves were stocked with jars of food he'd preserved all year. But when the world outside turned frozen and still, his neighbors would learn that Samuel's secret was no ordinary trick. It was a lesson in humility, foresight, and faith, one that would carry them all through the hardest winter they could have ever imagined. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if the spirit of perseverance and simple living speaks to you, join us for tomorrow's tale. The bitter winds of November began to tear at the worn edges of Lancaster County, sending dustings of snow swirling through the fields. The air was dry, and the earth, like an old hand, began to crack and wrinkle under the weight of frost. Within the walls of Samuel's small cabin, the stove glowed a quiet orange, and the smell of cinnamon and apples filled the air as he stirred the pot. His long fingers worked deftly, stirring with a rhythm born of years spent in this same humble routine. It wasn't the first time Samuel had prepared for winter. Each year, as the harvest season came to a close, he had grown accustomed to the solitude of his farm, the endless days of work in the fields, and the quiet stillness that came with the cold months. His family depended on him, but they knew little of the immense work Samuel had put into ensuring their survival through winter. He had worked late into the summer, harvesting crops, preserving fruits, and storing firewood. Every jar that lined the shelves was carefully sealed with faith that it would hold them through the hardest days. Samuel's secret, though, was in his cooking method, a trick learned from the old-timers and whispered across generations. He had perfected a way of cooking that required minimal firewood, a valuable commodity in the cold months when every scrap of wood mattered. While his neighbors used more conventional methods, burning through piles of wood and tending to large, inefficient fires, Samuel had discovered a quieter, more efficient way. One evening, just before the first snowstorm of the season began to settle over the valley, Samuel's neighbor, Jacob, knocked at the door. The wind howled through the trees, and Jacob's face was drawn tight with worry. He had seen the storm coming and knew there wasn't enough time to prepare. His own pantry was understocked, his firewood pile too thin to last. "Samuel," Jacob called as he stepped into the warmth of the cabin. "What's your secret? How do you manage to keep your fire going so strong with so little?" Samuel smiled faintly, his gray beard lighting up in the warm glow of the firelight. He set down his spoon and motioned for Jacob to sit. "It's not just the firewood you rely on, Jacob. It's the heart of the home, the way you prepare long before the storm comes." Samuel's words were simple, but they held the weight of decades spent learning from his father, who had always taught him that true survival in the winter came from patience and foresight. Jacob sat in silence, unsure of what Samuel meant. The storm outside raged, but the fire inside Samuel's cabin burned steadily, warm and constant, like a promise made in the darkest of times. By the time the first flakes of snow covered the ground, Samuel's cabin was a sanctuary. The air was thick with the smell of fresh bread baking in the oven and the sound of the wind howling outside. For days, the snow had fallen, blanketing the land in a thick layer of white. The world outside had turned still, save for the sound of snow brushing the cabin windows. Samuel sat before the hearth, carefully adjusting the temperature of his cooking pot. His hands moved with precision, adding a few more small logs to the stove, ensuring that the heat would last longer. In the quiet of the cabin, Samuel's thoughts turned to the winter ahead. It was not just the cold that kept him awake at night, but the knowledge of how much they had to endure, how much they had to rely on what they had prepared in the warmth of the summer. The bounty of the season wasn't just what had been harvested and stored away. It was what had been preserved with patience, in the simplest forms. His wife, Martha, had always been the heart of their household. She kept the shelves stocked with jars of apples, peaches, and berries, all carefully preserved from the year's harvest. It was a task they took seriously, knowing how precious each jar would become when winter closed in. Samuel always marveled at how much work went into each jar. Martha had never used any fancy equipment or elaborate techniques, just careful washing, boiling, and sealing. Yet these jars, these simple acts of faith, would sustain them when nothing else was available. Jacob had left his cabin hours earlier, but Samuel knew his neighbor would be back before the storm passed. Jacob would need help, and Samuel knew he had to be ready. But Jacob's pride had kept him from asking for assistance, something Samuel knew too well. The evening passed quietly. Samuel added more water to his cooking pot, stirring it as the steam filled the room. It was the method he had perfected, a way to cook with minimal fuel while keeping the warmth contained. Unlike the roaring fires that other settlers relied on, Samuel's stove worked with a system of heat retention, keeping his food warm with little wood and turning the stove itself into an efficient cooking tool. The fire glowed softly in the corner, the light flickering in the shadows. The quiet work continued, just as it always had. A hum of simplicity filled the space, no more, no less than what was needed to survive. But for Samuel, it was enough. He knew that when the storm passed, he would have one less worry than most of the men in the valley. For him, surviving winter was never about luck or chance. It was about preparing, staying steady, trusting in his work, and keeping the warmth of the family at the center of it all. The snowstorm raged through the valley for days. What had begun as a simple winter squall soon grew into a fierce blizzard, sweeping across Lancaster County with no sign of slowing. The wind howled through the cracks in Samuel's cabin, but inside, the hearth glowed warmly, the fire flickering with the rhythm of the carefully measured logs Samuel had placed inside the stove. On the third day of the storm, Jacob returned. His face was pale from the cold, his hands raw from trying to push his wagon through the deepening snow. He had come to seek help, but when he entered Samuel's cabin, he looked as though he had already accepted defeat. "Samuel," Jacob said, his voice hoarse from the cold, "I can't make it through this on my own. My firewood's running low. The pantry's half empty. I thought I could make it, but—" He trailed off, unable to finish. Samuel rose from his seat by the stove, his expression steady and calm, the years of hard work and experience showing in his quiet demeanor. He didn't need to ask for the specifics. He had known the storm would push the community to its limits. "We've been through this before," Samuel said softly, his voice firm with the weight of quiet wisdom. "When the storm comes, it's not about how much we have. It's about using what we've been given. We prepare, and then we trust." Jacob looked up, his eyes filled with exhaustion and uncertainty. "But I've been preparing all my life, Samuel, and still I find myself struggling. How can faith prepare me for the bitter cold of a winter like this?" Samuel moved toward the window, pulling back the thick curtains for just a moment to peer outside. The snow, now several feet deep, continued to fall relentlessly. He returned his gaze to Jacob, his face calm, yet resolute. "Faith doesn't keep the snow from falling. Faith doesn't stop the cold from biting at your bones. But faith is the fire that keeps you warm in the dark," Samuel replied. He reached for a jar from the shelf, one of many stored there over the long summer. With steady hands, he opened the jar and handed it to Jacob. "I've been where you are. I know what it feels like to wonder if there's enough. But there's always enough when we trust in the work we've done." Jacob took the jar, his hands trembling slightly as he turned it over. "This is what you meant preparing long before the storm comes, isn't it? All that work, it wasn't for nothing?" Samuel nodded. "It was never for nothing. Every hour spent preserving food, every log chopped for the fire, every meal prepared with care, it all adds up when it matters most. The storm will pass, Jacob. The cold will retreat. And you'll see that what we've built, what we've stored it, is more than enough to carry us through." Jacob looked down at the jar in his hands. For the first time in days, a small flicker of hope stirred in his chest. He placed the jar on the table beside him, taking a deep breath. "I'll stay. I'll trust." And so, in the midst of the storm, faith became the warmth that filled the space. Not just the warmth from the fire, but the warmth of shared understanding, of quiet strength and trust in the work done long before the snow began to fall. The storm raged for 2 more days, its fury never letting up. But inside Samuel's cabin, the warmth of the fire remained constant, the hum of daily life steady and unwavering. Jacob stayed with Samuel's family, and together they worked to ration the food and firewood, always keeping one eye on the storm and the other on the simple, necessary tasks that had kept them alive for so many winters before. It was on the morning of the 5th day that the winds began to subside, the snow gradually tapering off into a light dusting that covered the earth like a blanket. Jacob stood at the window, his breath fogging up the glass as he looked out over the snow-covered landscape. For the first time in days, he felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. The storm had passed, but more importantly, he had weathered it. Samuel joined him at the window, his face soft in the light of the new day. "The storm doesn't last forever," he said, his voice gentle, "but the lessons we learn from it do." Jakob turned to face him, his eyes clearer than they had been in days. "I think I understand now. It's not the preparation that makes the difference, it's the ability to trust in what we've done. The faith to believe that the work we've put in, the simple acts of care, will be enough when the storm comes." Samuel nodded, his gaze moving over the cabin, where the hearth still glowed softly. The hardest part is often trusting that enough is enough. We spend so much time worrying about what we don't have, that we forget to give thanks for what we do. The simplicity of the lesson wasn't lost on Jakob. The world outside might have been harsh, the storm unforgiving, but inside this cabin, there was a quiet strength that came from nothing more than honest work and simple faith. He had spent his life running from that simplicity, chasing after the next thing, always striving for more. But here, in this cabin, he had discovered that the simplest things, faith, work, and trust, were enough to carry him through the hardest days. As the morning wore on, Samuel and Jacob sat together by the fire, sipping hot tea from mugs Samuel had crafted himself. Jakob found comfort in the quiet rhythm of their conversation, in the shared knowledge that came from years of experience. "I never knew life could be this simple," Jakob said, shaking his head in wonder. "I've been so focused on getting by, on just surviving, that I forgot what it means to truly live." Samuel smiled, his eyes full of quiet understanding. "Living simply isn't about denying yourself anything. It's about finding joy in the things that matter most, the warmth of a fire, the love of family, the work that keeps us going." Jakob looked down at his mug, feeling the heat seep into his hands. For the first time in a long time he felt truly at peace. The storm had passed, but the lessons it had brought would stay with him forever. And as Samuel's cabin stood firm against the cold outside, Jakob knew that it was not just the cabin itself that had kept them safe. It was the quiet, enduring strength that came from the simplest of things: faith, preparation, and a life lived with purpose. By the time the final traces of snow had melted, Samuel's cabin stood as a quiet monument to endurance. The valley had returned to its peaceful routine, the hard winter now a distant memory. Jacob, his family, and the other neighbors had returned to their homes, their hearts and minds shaped by the lessons they'd learned in the cold. One morning, as Samuel prepared to stoke the fire for another long day of work, Jakob stopped by with a basket of freshly baked bread, the scent of it still warm in the air. "Samuel," Jakob began, his voice carrying the weight of gratitude, "I've been thinking. You didn't just survive the storm, you helped us all survive. You showed us something important, that sometimes it's not about fighting the storm, but trusting in the work we've done long before it arrives." Samuel paused, his eyes soft. He'd never expected thanks, only that his neighbors would learn to trust in what they had done together. The simplest truths, the quiet acts of faith, were often the hardest to see in the midst of hardship. Jakob continued, "I'll never forget that lesson. I've started building my cabin for the future, not just the present. You've taught me that preparation and trust are just as important as strength." Samuel smiled quietly, reaching for the basket. "It's the little things that matter most. Each task, each day, builds the foundation for the next." Jakob nodded, understanding at last. "And sometimes, those little things are enough to weather any storm." As Jacob left, Samuel watched the sun rise over the valley, the warmth of it flooding the cabin. For Samuel, the season had passed, but the quiet legacy of faith, humility, and trust in the simple things would endure long after the winter had gone.